A bustling high-end steakhouse falls dead silent as a police officer's heavy hand snaps onto the tailored shoulder of a quietly dining black man. The officer's voice echoes with unwarranted authority. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Officer Gregory Miller thought he had found an easy target, a man who supposedly matched a vague description, someone he could bully to stroke his own bruised ego. He expected fear. He expected immediate submission. What he didn't expect was the towering silver-haired man who had just returned from taking a phone call to slowly step up right behind him, an Admiral of the United States Navy. And Officer Miller was about to learn a brutal career-ending lesson in true authority. The humid evening air of Norfolk, Virginia hung thick over the cobblestone streets of the historic downtown district. Inside the Oak Haven Grill, however, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of seared prime rib, expensive oak-aged Merlot, and old money. The restaurant was a local institution, a place where senators, shipping magnates, and high-ranking military brass came to broker deals over $100 steaks. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm amber glow across the mahogany-panelled walls, and the soft murmur of polite conversation was underscored by the gentle clinking of sterling silver against fine china. Sitting at a secluded corner booth, David Caldwell appeared entirely at ease, though his eyes never stopped moving. At 38, David possessed the kind of quiet, coiled stillness that only came from years of surviving in environments where a single lapse in attention meant death. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit that expertly concealed the heavy musculature of his frame. To the casual observer, he looked like a successful venture capitalist or a high-powered attorney enjoying a rare evening of peace. But David was neither. He was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, specifically attached to a Tier 1 special mission unit. He had spent the last decade in the dust of the Middle East, the jungles of South America, and the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. His hands resting lightly on either side of his sparkling water bore the faint silvery scars of close-quarters combat and halo parachute rigging. Tonight, however, the war was far away. Tonight was a celebration. David was waiting for his commanding officer and longtime mentor, Admiral Thomas Sterling, who had excused himself to the front lobby to take a secure phone call from the Pentagon. Sterling was a 4-star legend, a man who had guided David's career since his days as an ensign, and tonight's dinner was to formally celebrate David's upcoming promotion. 3 blocks away, the atmosphere inside Squad Car 412 was anything but celebratory. Officer Gregory Miller sat behind the wheel, his jaw clenched, his thick fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. Miller was a 12-year veteran of the local police force, a man whose career had flatlined a decade ago due to a toxic combination of arrogance, a volatile temper, and a string of excessive force complaints that the Union had barely managed to sweep under the rug. He was a man who craved authority, but lacked the temperament to wield it responsibly. The police radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence in the cruiser. "Dispatch to all units in the downtown sector. We have a report of a grand larceny at the Wellington Jewelers on 4th Street. Suspect is described as a tall African-American male, wearing a dark suit. Last seen heading north on foot." It was a maddeningly vague description, the kind of generic bulletin that flooded the airwaves on a Friday night. But to Miller, it was an excuse. He threw the cruiser into drive, his tires squealing as he turned onto the main avenue. He wasn't interested in conducting a thorough investigation. He was looking for a reason to exert power to remind the wealthy denizens of downtown Norfolk that he was the one who controlled the streets. Miller parked his cruiser aggressively in the red zone directly outside the Oak Haven Grill. He adjusted his duty belt, the heavy leather creaking, and checked his reflection in the glass door before pushing his way inside. The transition from the noisy, humid street to the hushed elegance of the steakhouse was jarring. The maitre d' meticulously groomed man named Francois immediately stepped forward, his smile strained. "Good evening, officer. Is there an emergency?" Francois asked, his eyes darting to the heavy sidearm strapped to Miller's hip. "Police business. Step aside." Miller grunted, not even bothering to look the man in the eye. He bypassed the hostess stand and strode directly into the main dining room. His heavy tactical boots thudded against the plush carpet, a deliberately disruptive sound that caused several patrons to pause their conversations and look up in annoyance. Miller's eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the tables of older white men in golf polos and women in cocktail dresses. He was looking for someone who didn't fit his narrow prejudiced view of who belonged in a place that charged $50 for an appetizer. Then he saw him. Sitting in the corner booth illuminated by the soft glow of a brass table lamp was David Caldwell. Tall, black, and wearing a dark charcoal suit. Miller's heart gave a slight, satisfied thump. It didn't matter that David was calmly sipping water, that a half-eaten plate of oysters Rockefeller sat in front of him, or that he looked nothing like a fleeing thief. To Miller, David matched the description. More importantly, David represented a target. Miller adjusted his posture, puffing out his chest, and began the long walk across the dining room floor. He didn't notice the precise, calculated way David's eyes flicked toward him, tracking his approach in the reflection of a nearby window. David had spotted the officer the moment he entered the restaurant. His training had instantly assessed Miller's aggressive body language, the white-knuckled grip on his radio, and the unbroken predatory stare directed entirely at his table. David didn't panic. He simply placed his glass down on the white linen tablecloth, interlaced his fingers, and waited. "Excuse me." Officer Miller's voice was loud, carrying easily over the soft jazz playing through the restaurant's hidden speakers. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was a command. David looked up, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed but utterly immovable. "Good evening, officer. Can I help you?" "I need to see some identification," Miller said, coming to a halt, just inches from the edge of David's table. He planted his feet wide, resting his right hand casually near the butt of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic he had used 1,000 times before. David's brow furrowed slightly, though his voice remained exceptionally calm. "May I ask why you match the description of a suspect involved in a felony robbery up the street?" Miller lied smoothly. The call had been for grand larceny, not robbery, but Miller knew that elevating the perceived threat level gave him more leeway to act aggressively. "Now hand over your ID." A heavy silence fell over the immediate vicinity. The couple at the adjacent table stopped eating, their eyes wide as they stared at the confrontation. David leaned back slightly against the leather cushions. He knew the law intimately. He knew the parameters of a Terry stop, the requirements for reasonable, articulable suspicion, and the clear distinction between a consensual encounter and a lawful detention. "Officer, I've been sitting at this table for the past 45 minutes. The hostess seated me, and my waiter, I believe his name is Thomas, brought me these oysters 20 minutes ago. I haven't been near any jewelry store." Miller's face flushed. He hated being corrected, and he especially hated being calmly rationalized with by someone he had already decided was beneath him. "I don't care what you claim you've been doing. I'm conducting an active investigation. Your ID, now, officer." David said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational warmth, and taking on the cold, flat tone of a man accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations. "Unless you are detaining me under suspicion of a specific crime, I am not required to provide identification while I'm eating my dinner. Am I being detained?" The question hung in the air. Am I being detained? It was the ultimate kryptonite to an officer fishing for compliance without probable cause. Miller's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his uniform. The fact that the entire left side of the restaurant was now watching them only poured gasoline on his bruised ego. He couldn't back down now. Not in front of this crowd. Not to this man. "You're being a smart mouth." Miller sneered, stepping closer, his waist pressing against the edge of the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "You think wearing a nice suit means you don't have to follow the law. I said you match the description. That gives me the right to identify you." A generic description of a black man in a dark suit in a city of nearly 250,000 people does not constitute reasonable suspicion. Officer David replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "Furthermore, my presence in this establishment is well documented by the staff. If you'd like to speak to the manager to verify my arrival time, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you let me finish my meal in peace." Miller lost it. The calm, educated, and legally precise refusal shattered his remaining thin veneer of professionalism. In his mind, David wasn't a citizen asserting his civil rights. He was a suspect resisting a lawful order. "All right, that's it," Miller snapped. He reached down and unclipped the leather strap holding his handcuffs. The metallic clink was jarringly loud in the quiet restaurant. "Stand up. You're under arrest." David didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared at the officer with a look of profound, chilling pity. "On what charge?" "Obstruction of a police investigation and resisting detainment," Miller barked. "I told you to stand up. If I have to drag you out of that booth, I'm going to add assaulting an officer to the list. Now get on your feet." The restaurant was completely silent now. The jazz music seemed to have faded away entirely. Waiters stood frozen with trays of food in their hands. Francois, the maitre d', was frantically dialing a number on the hostess stand phone, his face pale. David remained seated. His hands were still visible on the table, a clear indication that he was not a physical threat, but his refusal to comply was absolute. He had fought terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan. A corrupt local cop having a temper tantrum was barely a blip on his radar. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, officer." David said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are crossing a line that you will not be able to walk back from." "I'm crossing a line." Miller laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy." Miller lunged forward, his heavy hand reaching out to grab the lapel of David's expensive suit, fully intending to physically haul the man over the table and slam him onto the hardwood floor. But Miller's hand never made contact. Before his fingers could graze the fabric of David's jacket, a shadow fell over the table. A presence so immense and commanding that the very air in the restaurant seemed to shift. From directly behind Officer Miller, a voice cut through the tension like a battleship's foghorn. It was a deep, gravelly baritone that had commanded fleets directed wars and dressed down 4-star generals. It was a voice that did not ask, did not negotiate, and absolutely did not tolerate insubordination. "I strongly suggest you remove your hand, son, before I have it legally amputated." Officer Miller froze. The grip he was about to lay on David hovered in mid-air. He spun around, a furious retort on his lips, fully prepared to arrest whoever had dared to interrupt him. He found himself staring directly into the icy blue eyes of Admiral Thomas Sterling. The Admiral had returned from his phone call just as Miller was making his approach. He had stood quietly in the shadowed archway leading to the lobby, watching the entire interaction unfold. Sterling was a towering figure standing 6'4", even in his late 60s. He was dressed in a sharp civilian suit, but he wore a small, undeniable lapel pin that caught the ambient light, a gold anchor resting behind 4 silver stars. Miller's furious retort died in his throat. He didn't know the man's rank yet, but the sheer overwhelming aura of authority radiating from Sterling hit the cop like a physical blow. Sterling stepped forward, closing the distance until he was chest to chest with the police officer, forcing Miller to crane his neck slightly to meet his gaze. "You have exactly 5 seconds," the Admiral said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried clearly to David's ears. "To explain to me why you are attempting to unlawfully arrest one of the most decorated special warfare officers in the United States Navy during his private celebratory dinner." Miller's face went completely white. The handcuffs dangled uselessly from his fingers, suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. The quiet before the storm had officially ended. The hurricane had arrived. Officer Gregory Miller felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy under the harsh fluorescent lights of the restaurant's opulent chandeliers. The heavy brass handcuffs dangling from his fingers suddenly felt like anvils pulling his arm down with the sheer weight of his catastrophic miscalculation. He stared at the lapel pin on the towering older man's suit jacket. 1 gold anchor, 4 silver stars. Even a beat cop with a stagnant career knew what that insignia meant. It was a rank so elevated, so far removed from the daily grind of municipal law enforcement that seeing it in person was like spotting a mythical creature. This wasn't just a commanding officer. This was a man who briefed the president, who commanded carrier strike groups, whose mere signature could mobilize tens of thousands of armed personnel. Miller stammered, his previously booming voice reducing to a pathetic, breathy squeak. The aggressive chest-out posture he had maintained just seconds ago collapsed like a punctured tire. "I asked you a direct question, officer," Admiral Thomas Sterling said. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The quiet, serrated edge of his baritone cut through the dead silence of the dining room with surgical precision. "I am waiting for your answer. Articulate to me right now the probable cause you possess to place hands on Lieutenant Commander David Caldwell." Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. His eyes darted nervously around the room. He suddenly realized that the ambient noise of the Oakhaven Grill had not just faded, it had vanished entirely. Dozens of the city's most affluent and influential citizens were staring directly at him. Worse, the faint, unmistakable glow of smartphone screens was rising from several tables. He was being recorded from at least 4 different angles. "He matches a description, sir." Miller managed to push out, desperately clinging to the standard police vernacular that usually served as an impenetrable shield. "Grand larceny. Down on 4th Street. I was conducting a standard Terry stop to identify a potential suspect." Sterling's eyes narrowed, a gesture that conveyed an ocean of contempt. He took 1 half step closer, entirely invading Miller's personal space. "Do not insult my intelligence, and do not attempt to hide your blatant prejudice behind the shield of procedural jargon." Sterling said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I have been sitting at this table with the Lieutenant Commander for the past hour. We ordered the 1998 Cabernet the oysters and 2 bone-in ribeyes. The staff can verify this. The security cameras in the lobby can verify this. The receipt in my pocket can verify this. Therefore, it is a physical, chronological impossibility for him to be your suspect." Miller took a shaky step backward, his boot bumping clumsily against the leg of a nearby empty chair. "I didn't know that. I was just acting on the dispatch." "You were acting on a desire to flex a pathetic modicum of authority." Sterling interrupted, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "You saw a black man in an expensive restaurant, decided he didn't belong, and fabricated a reason to humiliate him. You ignored his calm, logical explanation. You ignored the fundamental tenets of the 4th Amendment. And you were about to commit assault under the color of authority." David, who had remained perfectly still during this exchange, finally moved. He slowly, deliberately reached for his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and placed the cloth neatly on the table. The sheer calm he projected was almost more intimidating than the Admiral's overt anger. David looked at Miller, not with fear or even anger, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a predator assessing a vastly inferior opponent. "Officer," David said, his voice smooth and untroubled. "I asked you previously if I was being detained. You stated I was under arrest for obstruction. Since you have now been informed beyond a shadow of a doubt that your underlying suspicion was factually impossible, are you continuing with this unlawful arrest?" Miller was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. If he backed down now, he looked like a coward in front of a room full of people recording him admitting his fault. If he doubled down, he was actively arresting a highly decorated Navy SEAL in front of a 4-star Admiral who was already listing his civil rights violations. His ego, fragile and bruised, flared up in a final desperate act of self-preservation. "I'm conducting an investigation," Miller sneered, attempting to regain some semblance of control, though his hands were visibly trembling. He reached for the radio mic, clipped to his shoulder. "I'm calling for a supervisor, and I'm calling for backup. We have a non-compliant suspect and an interfering bystander." Sterling let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh that held absolutely zero humor. "An interfering bystander," the Admiral repeated, shaking his head. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. For a brief, terrifying second, Miller's hand twitched toward his service weapon, his training kicking in, but the sheer imposing presence of David, who had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, ready to launch across the table at the first sign of a drawn weapon, froze the cop in place. Sterling did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, government-issued smartphone. "You want a supervisor, officer?" Sterling asked, tapping a single number on his speed dial. "Let's get you a supervisor, but I think we can aim a little higher than a desk sergeant." Sterling brought the phone to his ear. The silence in the restaurant was so profound that several patrons sitting nearby could clearly hear the phone ringing on the other end. "Yes, this is Admiral Thomas Sterling," he said into the receiver, his eyes locked dead onto Miller's pale face. "Connect me directly to the personal cell phone of Chief William Barrett. Yes, I know it's Friday night. Tell him it's an absolute emergency regarding one of his patrol officers actively attempting to assault a federal officer." Miller's stomach dropped into his boots. Chief William Barrett, the chief of police for the entire city of Norfolk. The hammer of karma was no longer just falling, it was accelerating at terminal velocity. The 3 minutes it took for Chief Barrett to answer and comprehend the situation felt like 3 hours to Officer Gregory Miller. He stood frozen by the table, unable to retreat, unable to advance, trapped in a purgatory constructed entirely of his own hubris. "William Admiral Sterling," said warmly, though his eyes remained icy as they bored into Miller. "I apologize for interrupting your evening. I'm currently at the Oak Haven Grill on Main Street. I'm having dinner with Lieutenant Commander Caldwell celebrating his promotion to 05. A pause. Sterling nodded. "Thank you, I'll pass along your congratulations. However, we have a pressing issue. One of your patrol officers..." Sterling paused, glancing at Miller's chest. "An Officer G. Miller, badge number 4182, has just attempted to unlawfully arrest Commander Caldwell. He bypassed the restaurant staff, ignored the commander's alibi, attempted to physically drag him from the booth, and threatened him with assault charges for refusing an unlawful order. He is currently standing in front of me, hand hovering near his weapon, trembling like a leaf." Miller opened his mouth to protest, to shout that the Admiral was lying, but his vocal cords utterly failed him. The wealthy patrons around them were whispering furiously. The maître de François had already positioned himself near the front door, barring anyone from leaving or entering, turning the dining room into a sealed theatre for Miller's impending destruction. "Yes, William, I am certain," Sterling continued, his voice hardening. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is a textbook case of racial profiling, aggressive intimidation, and gross abuse of power. The commander is a Tier 1 operator who has shed blood for this country on 3 continents, and he is currently being treated like a vagrant by a man wearing your department's badge. Another agonizing pause. Miller could almost hear the furious shouting coming from the other end of the line. "I appreciate that," William Sterling said finally. "We will remain exactly where we are. Tell your people no sirens. We've disturbed these good people's dinners enough for one evening." Sterling lowered the phone and slipped it back into his jacket. He looked at Miller, who looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the executioner check the tension of the rope. "Chief Barrett is on his way," Sterling announced calmly. "He is bringing Captain Olivia Hayes from Internal Affairs with him. They were attending a charity gala 3 blocks from here. They will arrive in approximately 4 minutes. David finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The terrifying stillness of his demeanor shifted slightly, becoming intensely focused. "Officer Miller." David said, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a career-ending crisis. "In my line of work, we call what you just did a fatal funnel. You walked blindly into an environment you didn't understand, made aggressive assumptions based on flawed intelligence, and trapped yourself in a position with 0 tactical advantage and no exit strategy." Miller's chest heaved. He was suffocating under the weight of his own panic. "I was just doing my job. The dispatch," David interrupted softly, "was for a suspect fleeing north on foot. You found a man sitting quietly in a corner booth eating oysters facing the door. You didn't investigate. You hunted. You hunted because you thought I was weak. You thought I was vulnerable. You thought a dark suit and dark skin meant you could exert dominance without consequence." David tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes boring into Miller's soul. "You chose the wrong man, and you chose the wrong night." Outside, the heavy, muffled thud of car doors slamming echoed through the thick glass windows of the restaurant. There were no sirens as requested, but the flashing red and blue strobe lights of 3 unmarked black SUVs reflected intensely against the cobblestone street and illuminated the dining room in rhythmic bursts of neon colour. The heavy oak doors of the Oakhaven Grill swung open with a violent shove. Chief William Barrett, a broad-shouldered man with a thick grey moustache and a face red with fury, stormed into the restaurant. He was wearing a tuxedo, the bow tie already yanked loose and hanging around his neck. Right behind him was Captain Olivia Hayes, sharp and calculating in a dark pantsuit, her eyes instantly scanning the room and locking onto the disturbance in the corner. Flanking them were 2 massive, heavily armed sergeants from the gang unit who had apparently been acting as the chief's detail. The air in the room seemed to violently decompress. Miller took a staggering step backward as his ultimate superiors bore down on him. "Admiral Sterling," Chief Barrett barked as he approached, completely ignoring Miller. He extended a hand. "It is an absolute honour, sir, and I cannot express my profound apologies for this situation." "Chief," Sterling replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "This is Commander Caldwell." Barrett turned to David, who remained seated but nodded respectfully. "Commander, thank you for your service to this country, and I am deeply, deeply sorry that you had to endure this in my city." Barrett then turned slowly, like a battleship bringing its main guns to bear on a wooden dinghy. He looked at Officer Gregory Miller. The disgust on the chief's face was absolute. "Miller!" Barrett growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You have been a stain on this department for 10 years. I have read the excessive force complaints. I have seen the Union protect you. But right now, the Union isn't here. You just attempted to assault a decorated federal officer in front of a 4-star admiral and 50 witnesses. Chief, I can explain. Miller started raising his hands defensively. Shut your mouth! Barrett roared, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls, causing the crystal glasses on the tables to ring. You don't speak. You don't breathe heavily without my permission. Captain Hayes stepped forward, pulling a pair of zip ties from her pocket. She didn't bother with metal handcuffs. Zip ties were faster, more humiliating, and signaled a complete stripping of professional courtesy. Officer Miller. Captain Hayes said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Under the authority of the Chief of Police, you are hereby stripped of your police powers effective immediately. Surrender your service weapon, your taser, your radio, and your badge. Miller trembled violently. His hands shook as he unclipped his radio and set it on the empty table next to David's booth. He unbuckled his heavy duty belt, the leather slapping loudly against the floor as it dropped, taking his gun and taser with it. Finally, with fingers that could barely function, he unpinned the silver shield from his chest and handed it to the captain. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Hayes ordered. Miller, tears of panic and humiliation welling in his eyes, slowly turned around. The sharp zip of the plastic ties securing his wrists together sounded like the locking of a prison cell door. You are being detained pending a full internal affairs investigation for civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and attempted assault, Hayes stated clearly. You will be transported to headquarters. You will not pass go. You will not collect your pension. Chief Barrett looked back at David and the Admiral. Gentlemen, please finish your dinner. The bill is on the city tonight. Captain Hayes will reach out tomorrow to take your formal statements at your convenience. David picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and looked directly at the back of Miller's head as the disgraced cop was practically dragged toward the exit by the 2 gang unit sergeants. Thank you, Chief, David said quietly. We appreciate your prompt response. As Miller was hauled out into the humid Norfolk night, stripped of his power, his pride and his career, the restaurant remained silent for 3 long seconds. Then from a table near the back, an older gentleman in a tweed jacket began to clap. Slowly at first, then joined by another, until the entire dining room erupted into a round of applause as the doors swung shut, sealing Officer Miller's fate in the cold reality of absolute unforgiving justice. Inside the Oakhaven Grill, the ambient hum of polite conversation slowly returned, though the atmosphere remained fundamentally altered. The Maître de François personally delivered a fresh bottle of the 1998 Cabernet to David and the Admiral's table, his hands still trembling slightly as he poured. The restaurant staff treated the 2 men with a hushed, almost reverent awe. Admiral Thomas Sterling took a slow sip of his wine, the rigid tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. He looked across the table at David Caldwell. The younger officer had already resumed eating his oysters, his expression as calm and unreadable as the surface of a deep, dark lake. I have spent 40 years in the United States military. David Sterling said, his voice quiet but thick with lingering anger. I have seen the absolute worst of what humanity has to offer in war zones across the globe. But watching a sworn peace officer attempt to put hands on you in my own city, it makes my blood boil in a completely different way. David wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, meeting the Admiral's gaze. It is the reality of the world we live in, sir. The uniform I wear when I deploy commands respect. But when I take it off to men like Officer Miller, I am just a description on a police scanner, a target of opportunity. It shouldn't be your reality, Sterling replied firmly. And as of tonight, it will no longer be his. While David and the Admiral finished their celebratory dinner in peace, the fallout at the Norfolk Police Department headquarters was already escalating from a localized storm into a Category 5 hurricane. Captain Olivia Hayes did not go home. She bypassed her office entirely and marched straight into the Internal Affairs Records room. The physical manifestation of Gregory Miller's disgraced career was spread out across a large steel table within an hour. Hayes, a meticulous and unforgiving investigator, knew that an officer who acted with such brazen arrogance in a crowded high-end restaurant did not develop that behavior overnight. This was not a one-off mistake. It was a symptom of a deeply rooted disease. She pulled his personnel file, his use of force reports, and his civilian complaint history. It was a staggering, depressing read. Over the last decade, Miller had accumulated 14 separate complaints for excessive force racial profiling and unlawful detention. "How did you survive this long, you miserable son of a bitch?" Hayes muttered to herself, flipping through the pages. The answer was painfully obvious. The victims in Miller's past files were marginalized. They were young black men in low-income neighborhoods, individuals with prior minor drug convictions, or people who simply lacked the financial means and social standing to fight a corrupt system. When it was Miller's word against theirs, the police union had easily stepped in, obfuscating the facts and quietly burying the complaints in bureaucratic red tape. But tonight, Miller had committed the cardinal sin of a predator he had hunted outside of his usual territory. He had attacked a man with limitless institutional backing in a room full of the city's elite, directly in front of a 4-star Admiral. The door to the records room opened, and Detective Ramirez from the robbery division leaned in. He held a manila folder and looked thoroughly exhausted. "Captain Hayes, the chief said you were running point on the Miller situation," Ramirez said, stepping into the room. "I am," Hayes replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "Tell me you have an update on the actual grand larceny at the Wellington Jewelers." "We do," Ramirez said, placing the folder on the table. "My guys caught the suspect 4 blocks north of the jewelry store. He was hiding in an alley behind a dumpster with a backpack full of stolen Rolex watches." Hayes felt a cold, hard knot of pure vindication tighten in her chest. "Let me guess. He doesn't look a damn thing like a 38-year-old black man in a tailored charcoal suit." Ramirez let out a humorless chuckle. "Not even close. The suspect is a 19-year-old white kid named Kyle Higgins. He was wearing blue jeans, a heavily stained grey hoodie, and red sneakers. The jewelry store owner's 911 call was completely clear. He gave a perfect description of a white teenager in a hoodie." Hayes slowly closed the file she was reading. The twist of karma was almost poetic in its brutal efficiency. So, the dispatch call that Miller claimed gave him reasonable suspicion to detain Commander Caldwell was a complete verifiable fabrication, Ramirez finished for her. Miller didn't mishear the dispatch. He ignored it. He saw a black man in a fancy restaurant and decided to invent his own probable cause to harass him. "I already pulled the radio logs and the dispatch transcripts. It's rock solid, Captain. Excellent work, Detective." Hayes said, a dangerous, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Make copies of those transcripts. I want them on Chief Barrett's desk by sunrise. Officer Miller thought he could use the law as a weapon tonight. Tomorrow we are going to show him what happens when the law fires back." The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later in a windowless conference room on the top floor of the municipal building. The air in the room was stale heavy with the impending destruction of a man's livelihood. Gregory Miller sat at the long mahogany table looking nothing like the aggressive, chest-puffing bully who had stormed into the Oakhaven Grill. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, and a nervous sweat beaded on his forehead. Next to him sat Thomas Gable, the senior representative for the police union. Gable looked equally uncomfortable, constantly checking his watch and avoiding eye contact with anyone across the table. Directly opposite them sat Chief William Barrett, Captain Olivia Hayes, and a new terrifying addition to the proceedings, Special Agent Sarah Jenkins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. Chief Barrett opened a thick binder, the sound of the cracking spine echoing loudly in the quiet room. Gregory Miller. Barrett began his voice devoid of any warmth or professional courtesy. We are here to formally conclude the internal affairs investigation regarding your actions on the night of Friday the 17th. Are you prepared to hear the findings? Yes, Chief. Miller whispered, his voice trembling. Speak up, Barrett snapped. Yes, Chief. Miller repeated slightly louder. Captain Hayes took over, sliding a stack of photographs and transcripts across the table. Officer Miller, you claimed you initiated a Terry stop on David Caldwell because he matched the description of a fleeing suspect in a grand larceny. We have pulled the 911 audio, the dispatch logs, and the arrest report for the actual suspect, Kyle Higgins, a white teenager in a grey hoodie. Your foundational justification for the stop was a deliberate, malicious lie. Miller looked down at his hands, unable to look at the photos. I made a mistake. It was dark. I was confused. Do not lie to me in this room. Hayes fired back, her voice echoing off the walls. You weren't confused. You were arrogant. You bypassed the restaurant staff who could have verified his alibi. You ignored the commander's calm assertion of his rights. You unholstered your handcuffs and attempted to physically assault a citizen without a shred of probable cause. Thomas Gable, the Union rep, cleared his throat weakly. Chief Captain, my client acknowledges a gross lapse in judgment. However, given his 12 years of service, the Union is prepared to accept a lengthy unpaid suspension and mandatory retraining. Mr. Gable. Chief Barrett interrupted, raising a hand. Let me stop you right there. The Union isn't saving him this time, because this is no longer just a departmental issue. Chief Barrett nodded to the woman in the sharp navy suit sitting at the end of the table. Special Agent Jenkins folded her hands neatly in front of her. Mr. Miller. Jenkins said, her voice smooth and chillingly professional. Commander David Caldwell is an active duty federal officer. By attempting to unlawfully detain and assault him, you didn't just violate departmental policy, you committed a federal offense. Furthermore, your actions constitute a clear violation of Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Miller felt the room begin to spin. He looked wildly at his Union rep, but Gable was staring at the table, his face ashen. The Union protected bad cops from internal slaps on the wrist. They did not go to war against the FBI. We have reviewed your past files, Mr. Miller. Jenkins continued. Captain Hayes graciously provided them. We have found a clear, documented pattern of you using your badge to terrorize minority citizens. Because those previous victims lacked the resources to fight back, you thought you were invincible. You thought you were the law. Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Miller's terrified gaze. You are not the law. You are a bully who was handed a badge, and your reign of terror ended the second you tried to put your hands on a United States Navy SEAL. Chief Barrett closed the binder with a heavy, definitive thud. Gregory Miller. Barrett said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Effective immediately, your employment with the Norfolk Police Department is terminated. You are permanently stripped of your certification, meaning you will never work in law enforcement in this state or any other state ever again. Your pension is heavily frozen pending the outcome of your civil liabilities. Miller let out a choked, ragged gasp, burying his face in his hands. The reality of his complete destruction was finally setting in. Furthermore, Agent Jenkins added, standing up from her chair and straightening her jacket, the United States Attorney's Office has authorized criminal charges against you. You are officially under federal indictment for deprivation of civil rights and attempted assault of a federal officer. A warrant has been issued for your arrest. Two large FBI agents who had been standing quietly outside the conference room stepped through the doors. "Stand up, Mr. Miller," Jenkins ordered. Miller's legs felt like lead. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair, his cheap suit wrinkling, his entire body shaking as the agents moved in. The sound of metal handcuffs clicking around his wrists was identical to the sound his own cuffs had made just a few nights prior, but this time the heavy weight of justice was pulling him down into the abyss. As he was led out of the room, stripped of his power, his pride and his freedom, he caught one last glimpse of Captain Hayes and Chief Barrett. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a system finally purging its own poison. The hammer of karma had not just struck Gregory Miller, it had shattered him completely, leaving nothing behind but a cautionary tale of a man who forgot that true authority requires honor and that true justice always eventually balances the scales. 9 months later, the heavy oak doors of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia swung shut, sealing Gregory Miller inside a reality he could no longer manipulate. The sterile wood-paneled walls of the federal courtroom offered none of the opulent warmth of the Oak Haven Grill. Here, the air was entirely devoid of sympathy, replaced by the cold mechanical precision of the federal justice system. Miller sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out shell of the aggressive, broad-shouldered officer who had terrorized the streets of Norfolk. His cheap suit hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. The deep bags under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent agonizing over his shattered life. His wife had filed for divorce 3 months into the media circus, taking their house and moving back to Ohio. His former colleagues, men he thought were his brothers in blue, had universally abandoned him, publicly condemning his actions to save their own careers from the blast radius of Captain Olivia Hayes's relentless internal affairs purge. Across the aisle, seated calmly in the front row of the gallery, was Commander David Caldwell. He was no longer wearing the tailored civilian charcoal suit. Today, he was dressed in his full Navy service dress blues. The gold oak leaves of his newly pinned 05 rank gleamed on his collar, and the left side of his chest was heavy with ribbons, bronze stars, a purple heart, and commendations for valor that commanded silent respect from every federal marshal in the room. Sitting beside him, an immovable pillar of support, was Admiral Thomas Sterling. Judge William Harrison, a federal magistrate known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding civil rights violations, took the bench. The entire courtroom rose the rustle of fabric, breaking the heavy silence. "Be seated," Judge Harrison commanded, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked down at the disgraced cop, Mr. Miller. The judge began, his voice echoing loudly through the microphones. "The jury has found you guilty on all counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law and attempted assault of a federal officer. Before I pass sentence, is there anything you wish to say?" Miller slowly stood up, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edges of the defense table to remain upright. He looked back at David, his eyes watering, begging for a mercy he had never once shown his own victims. "I am deeply sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I lost my career, my family. I've lost everything. I just ask the court for leniency." Judge Harrison's expression remained carved in granite. "Mr. Miller, you did not make a mistake. A mistake is misreading a street sign. What you did was execute a calculated predatory abuse of power. You targeted Commander Caldwell because of the color of his skin, assuming his silence would be guaranteed by your badge. You believed you were the apex predator in a city that trusted you to protect it." The judge leaned forward, his gaze piercing through Miller. "But you picked the wrong prey, and in doing so, you inadvertently did this city a massive favor. Your spectacular arrogance exposed a rot within the department that Chief Barrett has now surgically removed. Because of your actions that night, 14 other officers with similar complaint histories have been dismissed. The systemic shield you hid behind has been dismantled. Miller's head dropped a single tear, escaping and rolling down his pale cheek. The ultimate karma had finally arrived. The badge you wore is a sacred trust, Judge Harrison continued. When you weaponize that trust, you do not just harm the individual, you damage the very fabric of our society. This court must send an unequivocal message that such betrayals will be met with the harshest penalties allowed by federal law. The judge picked up his gavel. Gregory Miller. It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 96 months, 8 years. This sentence is to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are remanded to the immediate custody of the United States Marshals. The strike of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. The 2 federal marshals moved in, instantly grabbing Miller by the arms. As they clamped the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, Miller let out a quiet, pathetic sob. He didn't look back as he was led through the side door, disappearing into the dark holding cells destined for nearly a decade in a federal penitentiary, where former police officers were forced to live in permanent, terrified isolation. In the gallery, Admiral Sterling turned to David. There was no celebration, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "It's done, Commander," Sterling said softly. David nodded, his posture perfectly straight. "Yes, sir, it is." They walked out of the courthouse together, emerging into the bright Virginia sunlight. The media was waiting at the bottom of the stone steps, cameras, flashing reporters shouting questions about the landmark verdict. David didn't stop to give a statement. He had no interest in the spotlight. He had a deployment scheduled in 3 weeks, and his focus was already shifting back to the men he led and the country he served. Justice had been served not just for him, but for every voiceless citizen Gregory Miller had previously crushed under his boot. The scales were balanced. This story is a powerful reminder that absolute arrogance will eventually crash headfirst into absolute authority. Officer Miller thought a badge gave him the right to act as a tyrant hunting citizens based on prejudice and ego. But karma works in mysterious, undeniable ways, and picking a fight with a Tier 1 Navy SEAL and a 4-star Admiral proved to be the ultimate career-ending reality check. True power doesn't need to shout, and true justice never forgets to balance the scales. If this story of instant karma, unwavering composure, and the brutal reality of justice hit home for you, make sure to hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a deeply satisfying story of a bully finally getting what they deserve, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible true-to-life story.